830th Contact Friday, December 30th, 2022, 2:04 HRS Billy. Greetings and welcome, dear friend. 1. You too, Edward, be thanked for your welcome, as also be greeted, dear friend. Billy, right at the beginning of our conversation I want to mention that the contact reports are corrected first by Bernadette, then by Christian and Daniela. This is because I was asked afterwards why the contact reports are only published a week or even later after the conversation. It is to be said that on the one hand I cannot call up and also write down what was said immediately after the conversation, but sometimes only 2 or 3 days later, because I have other work to do than just calling up and writing down the conversation reports. But once I have done that, the correction work is done by Bernadette and the further corrections are made by Christian and Daniela, before the contact report can be released onto the internet and to the interested parties 10 or 15 days after the conversation, depending on the situation. Depending on the length of the conversation and therefore the number of A4 pages it takes, it can take longer or shorter. In addition, everything is even more difficult because my work is constantly being interfered with by those energies and forces that are so vehemently at work that I cannot write a single sentence without wrong letters, signs and numbers creeping into various words, so that I have to correct almost every written word and free it from wrong letters, numbers and signs. This is not a joke, but meant seriously and corresponds to the facts, which can also be witnessed by those persons who can also observe this. 2. Unfortunately, this is not to be changed, as I know, because still the little ones, as you call them, have not found a solution to counter the attacks against you and the interference with your work. 3. It would take a very long time to effectively oppose these energies with their powers, for it was something that was completely unknown to them and had only been recognized through laborious research. 4. The fact that you can still work, also with great difficulties, is only because they were able to construct, you probably call it an energy protection screen, through which you are somewhat protected in a certain wise from general energy influences. 5. However, this is only generally directed at very little, consequently the majority of the energy influences remain, consequently, somewhat weakened, nevertheless everything remains and influences your work heavily. 6. But the important thing is that you can work and say and explain all that is necessary for Earth humans to learn from it. 7. And they need this more than ever before, which is why from now on you will have to say and explain much more and in a much more definite manner than before. 8. Your new book will contribute something to this, but it will not be enough, so that after your departure it will be the task of the members of FIGU to continue the mission, within the framework that you have done so far, and without one member elevating himself/herself above the other and wanting to rule and direct, because that would inevitably be the downfall of the FIGU Association. 9. There must be order all round, but it must never be the case that one person elevates himself/herself above others, directs others and sets a must that something should be done. 10. It should always remain a request and a should, but never a command that something should be done. 11. However, if there is a person who does not understand this or wants to change it, then he/she is to be reprimanded or excluded from direct membership, because otherwise FIGU could not exist and operate in the manner that is required. 12. And this also applies externally with regard to the required openness, which means that all that is required to be said, disclosed and explained is said and explained. 13. In all cases, however, it is to be stated in a neutral manner, but never in a commanding tone, for this would inevitably immediately evoke negation. Billy, there I have to ask you, however, if I may once openly say what really is with America and their NATO as well as with Zelensky and the Ukraine as well as with Russia? I think that it should not be concealed what various governments are really hiding from the public, lying to them in an incendiary manner and deceiving them and even falsifying conference treaties in order to be right later when they do the opposite of what was verbally agreed upon. And the fact that hatred and racism against Russia and the Russians is rampant must also be spoken about. In the written media as well as on television, there is only one-sided reporting of the war events in Ukraine, and usually only in favor of Ukraine and the lying actor Zelensky, who is tremendously bellicose and is in America's service and can give free rein to his racism and hatred against Russia and the Russians without the human beings recognizing the dirty game he is playing for the hegemony of America. But referring to the general Russophobia of many human beings, the following is to be said for once with the earthly humanity: a true Russophobia is an anti-Russianism based on a negative attitude towards Russia and Russian culture. All this is based on xenophobia, which results from fear and is actually called xenophobia resp. Xenophobia in Greek. Hardly any of the human beings who suffer from this Russian phobia, if I may say so, know why it exists at all, not even those who sit in government offices and spread their fear and the resulting hatred and criticize Russia and its people in every conceivable manner. But I would like to say what the real origin is, namely once again religion and thus the delusion of a dear God. How could it be otherwise, in the form of the polytheism trinity, which is presented to the stupid believers by the religious powers as monotheism. This, although it is really about a polytheism in the form of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, which the idiots in chief illogically want to have declared as a unity. This is in addition to the fact that, at least in Catholicism, Mary and dozens of saints are still worshipped and adored resp. Idolized. But in order to get to the bottom of the matter and thus to explain how xenophobia and xenophobia, hatred of Russians resp. Anti-Russianism developed in the Middle Ages and in early modern times, whereby Russia and its peoples have been consciencelessly humiliated by these degenerations ever since, the following should be said and explained in truth: all the negative portrayals concerning Russia and the Russians are based on religious reasons, precisely, how could it be otherwise, which date back to the 13th century. In this respect, the context was that the Teutonic Order and the schismatimus strictly practiced in the East were at loggerheads. There was the Occidental Schism, as well as the so-called Great Schism resp. The Great Occidental Schism, and it was a temporary schism that took place within the Latin Church of the Catholic Church, with competing papal claims in Rome and Avignon from 1378 to 1417. The word schism is Greek, correctly schism in origin, and means something like division resp. Separation, which today is actually understood to mean secession from an existing denomination. So the German order and Eastern schismatism at that time brought with them theological differences, as well as rebellion against certain authorities. The schism of the Church is presented with the term schism and actually means a split of faith within an established religious denomination, and without the formation of a new theological view, which is also called heresy, a deviation from the official opinion of the Church, which is supposed to correspond to a damnable opinion, which is called with the word heresy. According to the religious struggle of the Teutonic Order against the schismatics of the East, the Russians, who were devoted to schismaticism, were called infidels and thieves for allegedly plundering the lands of those Christians who held the faith of the Teutonic Order. Then came the turning point around the 16th century. Then came the turn around the 16th century, when the Russian-Lithuanian War took place between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Grand Duchy of Moscow over the inheritance of Kievan Russian. The main issue was that the Rurikid princes of Moscow claimed to be able to rule over the whole of Rus, but this met with stiff resistance from the Polish-Lithuanian personal union. It went so far that the king, his name was probably Sigismund, if I remember the name correctly, turned to the Pope and to the European rulers resp. Rulers and claimed that the Muscovites were enemies of Christianity who wanted to destroy it, which is why they had conspired with the Tartars and the Turks. Incidentally, I would also like to say that with the Livonian War, Europeans traveling to Russia reported of a great tyranny that the Russian Tsar Ivan the Strict, which erroneously circulates in history under Ivan the Terrible, exercised over his people, who had over 5,700 human beings executed during his 37-year murderous tyranny. As a result, the Tsar's actions became widespread and the image of an extremely repressive Russian rule was created, which made Russia and its peoples even more infamous. But the actual anti-Russian views only really emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, in France, when in Europe the Enlightenment and recognition, despite all the negativities against Russia and its peoples, still had a good and positive relationship overall. While some of the human beings of Europe still had a somewhat acceptable opinion of Russia, Napoleon Bonaparte stirred up the bad against the peoples of the Russians and called them barbarians. He proclaimed that the Russians in general were not only backward, but also primitive, but that his ideas were liberal and revolutionary, which the Russians stood in the way of realizing. This probably also led to the fact that the French soldiers in the Russian campaign, which was probably in 1812 or so, showed a particular disrespect for the Russian people and their cultures as well as a hostility towards Russians that could not have been dirtier and more murderous. The French troops knew neither decency, mercy nor respect and dignity, for they consistently plundered not only monasteries and churches in all the conquered territories, but they also completely robbed the citizens, raped women and girls, as is also currently happening in the war in Ukraine. Billy, yes, I am thinking of that, but what this Zelensky and his military will get up to this week should be known by those governments supplying arms to this fake guy, as well as those from the populations friendly to this fake Haney. As I know from my recollection with Svath, Putin will arrange from the Russian side to stop the war activities for about 24 hours when the time of Russian Orthodox Christmas comes, which will be next week. He will arrange for this to actually take place, but Zelensky will not abide by this, but through his military will break this fighting calm unilaterally arranged by Putin and launch attacks against the Russians, who will then logically defend themselves, and so fighting will take place. Zelensky will call Putin's ceasefire announcement a lie, and in order to make this lie appear correct, he will order the Ukrainian military to launch attacks against the Russian forces, who will of course repel the attack and retaliate by force of arms. This in turn will be used by Zelensky to validate himself and his lies, which will be believed unthinkingly by Zelensky friends all over the world, and Russia will be made to look all the more like a pig, as anti-Russia has done since time immemorial. Ta. 17. This should certainly be correct, but really fraught with great dangers, for the truth of political intrigue and deceit should never come out in the open among earthly leaders. Billy, I know that, and they will certainly deny everything, besides the fact that I run the risk that now also in this respect the devil will be in the roof, as they say. The truth is always countered and silenced, especially when someone dares to expose dirty political dealings that are kept secret from the public. This is also why various human beings go crazy and turn into anarchists or assassins, just as religious backgrounds also play a part in this, as will be the case, for example, in about a week's time when Islamist fanatics, which, if I remember correctly, will attempt to launch a biotoxic assassination in Europe on behalf of the Islam fanatic Persian regime. The Islam fanatics in the Persian government who execute young human beings for demonstrating and demanding freedom will, after all, turn against those, such as Germany, who dare to be rebellious against the murderous methods of the Persian regime. Especially the young, inexperienced, uneducated and stupid foreign minister Baerbock has such a big mouth, drooling with stupidity, that it is heard in Persia by the religious fanatical dictators and arouses even more hatred in them, enjoining them to hang more human beings on ropes in the name of Allah, because they are obsessed with the delusion that this is the correct manner to defend the faith in Allah and His laws. But Muhammad did not say these Allah's laws and never brought them, for he spoke of true love, but never of killing and of torture and murder, as he also tried to prevent wars shamefully instigated and waged in his name, etc., with which he never had anything to do, but which are slanderously attributed to him. But there is more to be said. It is not for nothing that journalists are murdered every year, who are on the verge of telling the truth, but can no longer say anything because they are killed first. But certain media, as I also know, are so dependent on politics that they shirk the truth and simply keep quiet when it comes to spreading the truth. If someone tells the truth, then vehement action is immediately taken against the human being in question and attempts are made to silence him, if nothing other is possible, by murdering him. Practically, a witch hunt is immediately organized against every person who dares to tell the truth, as it was already at that time when those were also accused of witchcraft and murdered and executed who stood up for the innocence of the alleged witches and sorcerers, because through their protestations of innocence they took up the defense for the innocent women and men accused of witchcraft. There was also no record of the fact that the few human beings who spoke out in defense of the human beings accused of witchcraft were often also accused of witchcraft as accomplices and murdered. It happened as usual. Whoever dared to speak up in defense of a person accused of witchcraft gambled with his life and was himself accused of witchcraft and handed over to torture and death. A fact that is still concealed today, as well as the fact that human beings are still playing with their lives today, suspected of being witches and sorcerers and therefore murdered in a murderous manner. But that is not enough, because even today in Africa, in Kenya among other places, official state-justified witch trials take place, in which the alleged witches and sorcerers are publicly executed, as I was able to see for myself together with Florina. But that is only in passing, because I actually want to talk about something else. None of those rulers who supply weapons to Zelensky resp. to Ukraine, or who support this, is concerned about the fact that they bear the entire and comprehensive responsibility for the fact that the war in Ukraine can continue to rage, and that it is claiming a great many human lives and thus deaths. This war is actually made possible by those irresponsible stupid idiots who partisanly supply weapons to Zelensky or even advocate this. Zelensky, who turned out to be a great war supporter and is a passionate warmonger of the highest order, uses his cleverness to hypocritically make the people believe in the war as a free Ukrainian victory, etc. with words and his big mouth. And one wonders how stupid those human beings must be who believe him and do not realize that his words are aimed solely at hatred, power addiction and belligerence, as well as the fact that he is walking over corpses by senselessly chasing human beings into war, which was actually fundamentally provoked by America with its NATO. And all this only in order to destroy Russia and ultimately to be able to incorporate it into the long-cherished hegemony, in which Zelensky, he assumes, then intends to play an important role. But all the stupid governments that supply weapons do not notice this, and neither do the supportive sections of the population, who are biased and unilaterally court Zelensky. Of course, this does not mean that Russia resp. Putin should be regarded as a holy lamb, because what is being done from his side is also murderous devilry and therefore not correct, because neither hatred, war nor retaliation or revenge, nor annexation, murder and destruction or other hostile and unjust actions of any kind can ever be right, but only wrong and unjust as well as inhumane. Consequently, Putin's irresponsible actions in his war are also to be condemned and in no wise endorsed or even justified. Everything of a war is never based on logic, clear understanding and on reason, righteousness and humanity, but only on hatred, revenge, retaliation, massacre, murder, torture and manslaughter, as well as on the destruction of human achievements and vital cultivated land, this while nature in general and its fauna and flora are also severely affected and damaged, harassed, demolished, ruined and also killed. But none of the guilty parties gives the slightest thought to this, not the irresponsible arms suppliers, nor also their stupidly stupid supporters. All the irresponsible arms suppliers and their supporters of the populations are guilty that the war continues senselessly, that human beings are tortured to death, that thousands of human beings die, that many become cripples, that women and girls are raped and often murdered afterwards, often by their own people, by the military, who then lifefully blame the enemy for these atrocities. And so devastating destruction is wrought, just as cultivated land and planted food is destroyed, just as human beings fall into misery and suffer hardship. Every person who supplies weapons and those who support them in the population must be thinking irresponsibly, you will not be killed yourself, and your own things will not be destroyed. Let them bash their heads in, because it does not affect me. Well, how would it be if all these fools, the very arms suppliers and supporters of arms being supplied, were themselves those who were being raked with these arms, or that they themselves were on the front line and the bullets of their supplied arms were flying all around their skulls? If the earthling were to consider everything of a war rationally, then the question would automatically arise, what would it be like if the loudmouthed and power-hungry who want to provoke or have provoked a war, or those who want to unleash a war or have unleashed one, or those who, loud-mouthed, war-enthusiastic and full of war mania, wage a war and call on the people to murder and destroy and make big noises, or simply supply weapons for a war or advocate it, had to fight the war themselves personally with the weapons supplied or advocated? This with opponents with whom they are not personally at loggerheads and do not know why they should massacre, torture and kill fellow human beings who are completely foreign to them? This is only because vindictive and power-hungry government idiots want it so and abuse the people in order to be able to play out their personal might. But fundamentally, it is usually not the people who provoke the wars, but a person or persons in the government who have military at their disposal, who are then called upon to take up arms against the alleged enemy, usually with a severe penalty for non-compliance, who in reality is not an effective enemy of the people in question, but an enemy of the contracting state power or powers. The rule is in fact that it is individual or small groups of state powers or other power groups, power fanatics or religious delusionists, etc., who seek or provoke war. It does not matter to the warmongers for whatever nasty, fanatical, self-opinionated, power-hungry, religious, money-hungry or any other reasons they seek to enforce with war what is conceived, exists and is to be fought for by them as a justification, and without any quarter given to murder and manslaughter, destruction and annihilation, and without any consideration for losses. All those involved in the delivery of weapons, the governments and the supporting sections of the population, are effectively guilty of the thousands of murders and all the enormous destruction of vital cultivated land, as well as the general impairment of nature and the fauna and flora. And it is these stupid non-thinking people altogether, those in power and those in favor, who, with regard to the arms deliveries to Zelensky, do not give a thought to the fact that they have triggered an indirect world war and also let it be waged unilaterally. Ta. 24. It is to be said that our efforts took us back to the time when the relevant negotiations for the aforementioned treaty were conducted, which fundamentally had nothing whatsoever to do with NATO's eastward enlargement, but with Germany's future membership of NATO, to which Russia agreed. 25. This conference, which we, following your questions backwards, listened to directly and unrecognized, was, as we found out, aimed at the reunification of the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, which had become coming into force by means of a state treaty. 26. Aligned with this, Russia withdrew, which, however, remained a one-sided affair, for America remained in Europe, namely in Germany, true to its undeniable striving for world domination. 27. Our undoubted records prove that the then U.S. Secretary of State of America, James Baker, verbally and effectively bindingly formulated to Edward Shevardnadze of the USSR, which our records prove, which absolutely also corresponds historically to the truth, that the assurance was given by the representation of the West that no NATO expansion eastwards from the external border of the German Democratic Republic, which was to be abolished, would take place if henceforth the German Democratic Republic no longer existed. 28. This promise-like promise was given privately in front of 3 listening witnesses, such as Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Douglas Hurt and Roland Dumas, who were present as representatives at the time when the state treaty was drawn up for Germany and the GDR by America, France, England and the Soviet Union. 29. So if it is claimed to the contrary that this was not said, then this corresponds to a serious malicious lie, because this promise was effectively given verbally at the so-called 2+4 negotiations, but only privately and in no official naming and recording. 30. In any case, the promise was made, but shortly afterwards none of the witnesses wanted to know anything about it. Billy, I do not want to have anything more to do with this, which is why I distance myself from it, because I cannot prove the lies of politics anyway, because the truth is vehemently denied throughout, and politics is perfect at that, so to speak. So it's testimony against testimony, and that is simply not enough to prove anything. What you say, I just take as what you say, which I know that you have probably fathomed the truth, but which I cannot prove, because I was not there myself at the time and therefore cannot judge anything. So it is sufficient for me what you say, but which I cannot judge, but can only understand neutrally as information given by you, which you have probably clarified concerning my question, for which I thank you all, but which, as I said, I can only understand as information on your part and yours, but cannot judge, but just take it as valuable information and classify it in my trains of thought. Ta. 31. I'm sure that is a good thing. Billy, good. I can only say with certainty what I know effectively from my own experience and thus from personal experience. It is not possible for me to do otherwise because I was not there myself, so only your direct notes would help me. But I do not really want to know that, because it is not my thing to get involved in dirty politics. What I do know for sure, however, is that since 2019 I have been on the road quite frequently alternating with Florina and Bramunda, and have seen and experienced for myself on the spot what really happened, that I, Ta. 32. Ta. They told me about that several times, also that Karen told you, Billy, yes, that had to come, yes, she often cut my hair, because of course it grew back in my absence from the center, which was a bit conspicuous, because nobody knew about the time travel. But I do not want to talk about that, because that is not important. More important is the worldwide confusion that has been created since the outbreak of the corona epidemic with the useless vaccinations, which for many human beings became a factor that brought not protection from the epidemic but long-term suffering or death. Especially now the country of origin of the epidemic is being afflicted by it, and so China will be the subject of much talk in the near future, for now the time has come for the great dying as a result of the epidemic to begin. Although attempts will be made to suppress the truth, as is politically customary, it will not be possible to conceal it completely. apart from the mendacity with the fraud of vaccinations as well as with the various vaccines, which were not tested at all or only in a very slipshod manner, with which the vaccine manufacturers were able to amass immense fortunes, there has also been a veritable escalation of measures with promises of health preservation that have crept into the minds of humanity. Many of these steps were just dodges that did not deliver what they were supposed to. However, there have been many deaths who got vaccinated even though they did not know whether their immune systems were suitable for the vaccine in question. Others became sufferers, possibly for the rest of their lives, while for others the vaccination was simply as good as useless. All in all, vaccination does not protect against being susceptible to any variation resp. Mutation of the corona disease, which is why repeated vaccinations were also recommended. It was obviously known that everything was nothing more than a ploy to lull the general population into a false sense of security, in the hope that they would remain calm and not go crazy. Unfortunately, it could not be prevented that lunatic and stupid conspiracy theorists appeared in the process, just as it could not be prevented that many human beings believed these idiots and behaved accordingly. Consequently, they were infected with the corona plague and died. Ta, 33. According to our investigations, the plague has so far claimed almost 9 million lives, thus far more than earthly calculations indicate. 34. The end of the epidemic is not yet over, although the really good measures taken by governments are now being irresponsibly cancelled or have already been cancelled. 35. But talking about it is also useless, because only a few sensible people think about how to continue to protect themselves by wearing respirators when in contact with foreign persons. 36. But there is no point in discussing this, so something else needs to be addressed. 37. If we look at the last years after Gorbachev, not only at the politics of Russia, but also at the politics of the whole world up to the present day, then it is psychologically inevitable to see and judge that war was lurking everywhere on the whole earth, i.e., long before even an open threat of war was made. 38. And today war continues to lurk, for a pattern of the establishment of an enemy image can be seen everywhere, and indeed all over the world, for every government gang, one can no longer say otherwise, is more or less opposed to the machinations of the rulers of another state, with the public media doing everything in its power to break this enemy image. 39. This also applies in a different wise to the demonstrators, who recently call themselves the last generation and who stick to the streets just as they destroy expensive cultural property. 40. The truth is that these demonstrators, who behave and act in a querulous manner, are stupid and completely misguided, ignorant and deliberately incited persons, who really do not know what they are doing and what they are doing it for. 41. They are demonstrating harmfully for something that, in their false championing manner, will not bring success and is, moreover, criminal. 42. They do not see and do not think that it is they themselves who are doing everything to ensure that the whole world is harassed and destroyed because of them, that they themselves are the cause of the fact that slowly but surely all life on Earth is becoming more and more endangered in its existence and is slowly being wiped out. 43. This includes that nature, the atmosphere, the water and the climate lose the possibility of existence and become impossible to regenerate. 44. The truth is such, that only this will thus end everything and make a new beginning, so that a compulsory cessation of births is decreed as soon as possible, because the whole evil is based on the fact that there is an Earth population, according to which all life on the planet Earth will inevitably be slowly wiped out. 45. Billy, interesting, you come up with exactly what I keep saying. The demonstrators should learn to think for once instead of just indulging in illusory thinking, then they would realize that it is in their own hands that the environment is no longer destroyed. For the more human beings disappear from the world, precisely because fewer are born offspring are prevented, at least for a certain time, the more the evils that destroy the environment disappear. But the process takes years, so it is best to do without offspring until the age of 33 or 35. Only in this wise is it possible, on the one hand, to urgently and necessarily reduce overpopulation and, on the other hand, to put an end to environmental pollution and thus environmental destruction. As a consequence, namely, all the companies and corporations will disappear that produce vast quantities of goods that are then bought by the human beings. The massive number of overpopulation that throws the waste away into nature. The exploitation of the Earth's resources, petroleum, gas, rare earths, gold, ores of various kinds, etc. will be drastically reduced, just as the countless vehicles will disappear from the roads that pollute the air with CO2, making it toxic and destructive and also causing cancer and other diseases in human beings. In agronomy, i.e., agriculture and gardening, the spreading resp. Fertilizing and protecting with poison in the form of chemical agents will disappear, which will also mean the disappearance of chemical factories and chemical companies. Fertile land is freed up and can be cultivated again for natural food. Forests important for all life are no longer cut down, but destroyed forest areas are replanted and secure the oxygen. Billy, you are not telling me anything new, for I have known this ever since we, Svath, your father, and I together, have seen this and that in the future and have seen quite evil. But to talk about it further, or even to ponder it, is useless. Very few will think about what is to come. So it is probably wiser for me to talk about something else. It is now just over 30 years since the end of the Cold War, but a Cold War that was really only between the USA and the Soviet Union. Now, however, a new war has been ignited, the war in Ukraine, which was started by Russia resp. Vladimir Putin, but was in fact fueled and then finally ignited by America's guilt and its NATO. So Putin was really provoked by America's actions, which together with Ukraine's President Zelensky wanted to bring Ukraine into the NATO war criminal alliance for the sake of terror. This contrary to what was said and given as a promise, as just in the 1990s, and privately and unilaterally, but it was a promise to the Soviet Union and Russia respectively, as you have now noted. It was a promise made by America, based on a promise made by the American representative, who also openly represented NATO, which is actually the work of America and, contrary to all claims to the contrary, has been directed by it since the very beginning, that NATO was no longer interested in eastward enlargement. In doing so, I want to leave out what you said earlier, what you plagiarin have just recorded, that a promise was actually made that there would be no eastward enlargement. In any case, it is clear to me that the whole thing had to lead to tensions and ultimately triggered the war in Ukraine, which Vladimir Putin rashly, irrationally and irresponsibly launched with a massive Russian troop deployment on Ukraine's eastern border. The whole thing, however, was obviously because America did not want to deviate from its demands and bring NATO to Ukraine, together, of course, with Zelensky, what the senile US President Biden and, in the background, the shadow government have come up with. The fact that the existence of this shadow government is officially vehemently denied by America, and that they together provoked everything so nastily that Putin went crazy, lost patience and struck out, that was expected. But it was really neither intelligent nor correct of him, because it was already obvious in advance that the majority of the human beings of the world will stand by Zelensky and help him, because America will pull the strings behind everything. And this also happened, and so it came about that various stupid people from different countries began to supply Zelensky with weapons, often encouraged by sections of the population, which triggered a special kind of world war, the likes of which had never been seen before. This also led to the escalation and prolongation of this war, which is still going on today, for which all those who supply weapons to Zelensky or support this must be held responsible. They are all the culprits who are responsible for every death of Russians and Ukrainians who lost their lives in the war, which would have been over within 16 days if it had not been for the fools who supplied weapons or who otherwise supported it. All of them, the arms suppliers and the supporters, are the ones responsible for the deaths of many thousands of human beings and the enormous and devastating destruction caused by these weapons. And all this because, on the one hand, America and Zelensky, as well as from time immemorial, have been stirring up an unbridled hatred against Russia, and this still exists today, although hardly anyone knows why this hatred exists. So also only out of hatred against Russia its military is accused of various war crimes, while the similar crimes of the Ukrainian military are not mentioned at all. All the war reporting is done only against Russia, while all the crimes and acts of war etc. of Ukraine are hushed up. Just as it also happens with the Jew hatred of ex-Pope Ratzinger alias Pope Benedict XVI, who also made private records about it, but which were simply destroyed and made to disappear after his death. The Catholic Church simply passes over this in silence, as was already the case with Pope Pius XII, who was an unparalleled Jew hater. But the polytheism of the Catholic Church did not only produce the popes who hated Jews, but also the death penalty for all those who held a different opinion or a different faith, that is why there were also the religious wars, the torture for disrespecting religion, the persecution of witches and heretic courts with the death penalty, and so on. Tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands and millions of human beings died, were tortured, violated, tormented, massacred, executed or otherwise miserably murdered, and this always in the name of religion, faith and all-embracing love of the polytheism Trinity. And the delusion still prevails that religion, faith, God and prayer etc. bring and give salvation, with which love is also preached, but in reality torture, murder and sexual abuse have been practiced since time immemorial. Where was the love that has been preached hypocritically since time immemorial, which supposedly a dear God should give and also the believing human beings should cultivate and also give? Well, the war in Ukraine was preceded by a number of political things about which the public was not or only insufficiently informed, namely that the government in Moscow published drafts of 2 agreements aimed at stopping the earlier and ongoing eastward expansion of NATO, which had taken place and was now to be expanded with Ukraine. The desire to bring NATO into Ukraine was clearly connected with a push and truly military annexation of the Atlantic Alliance to the east, which the Russian side had to stop and prevent, like the establishment of further U.S. military bases in Ukraine, which as an independent state, like all others that formerly belonged to the Soviet Union, which in 1990 had not yet been incorporated into NATO, was henceforth to fall under the military command of the USA. There was also a demand that NATO withdraw its troops to the 1997 positions. These drafts also demanded that the USA move its nuclear arsenal away from Western Europe, i.e., remove it. The USA and NATO, however, responded to Moscow's demands in writing by making it clear in a high-handed and hostile manner that in principle things would remain as they were, because there was no room for negotiation, because each state was free, so each could also decide for itself whether it wanted to enter into an alliance with NATO or not. Moreover, the Ta 49. It was considered, however, that further conversations were possible in each case. Point 50. But in my opinion, this all deviates from what we have been able to record. Point 51. Also here, works of lies found their entrance into the falsehood of politics, consequently the security order of Europe was not only disturbed by the USA and NATO, but the whole thing was shamefully falsified and disregarded by statements of lies. Point 52. America's presence in Europe on the espionage side existed long before the last World War. In 1939 to 1945, American spies were secretly active in Germany before and after the war, as we know, because the spies were observed and monitored by us. Point 53. The espionage activities were carried out under the patronage of the USA President Franklin D. Point 54. Roosevelt and the USA Vice President Harry S. Truman. Point 55. Only the two of them and very few other people knew about this, because Roosevelt and Truman were concerned that no one should find out about the espionage activity against Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Consequently the whole thing remained secret and also no written records were made of the whole espionage enterprise. Billy Spath already spoke of this, but his order was to keep quiet about it, which I also did until today, and I do not want to say anything about it either. What I will say, however, and what I do know, is that Russia was always anxious, and I think rightly so, given the American hegemony mania, to intervene against the American presence in Europe in order to limit its spheres of influence on the continent. The USA, however, has always vehemently opposed this, which Russia never accepted, because it smelled a rat very early on about the American desire for world domination, which became recognizable to Russia in 1992 at the latest, but which was not acceptable to the masters in the Kremlin, not even to Putin, who could not accept that Ukraine, on Russia's doorstep, should now also become a NATO country. His wrong and thoughtless reaction as a result of losing patience was the beginning of the war, which America, however, hoped for, as America's shadow government also secretly aspired to, according to which the war addict Zelensky came in very handy for them, who consciencelessly incited the Ukrainian people and thereby prolonged the war thanks to the arms deliveries. This is also connected with the fact that other states are unhesitatingly and biasly taking up the banner against Russia and supplying weapons to Zelensky, which cost enormous amounts of money and which the people will have to pay off and repay with high taxes for many years and decades after the war. Indeed, it is not to be assumed that the arms suppliers will give the many weapons to Zelensky as a gift, but that they will charge for them later. Ta. 56. In my opinion, this will also be the case, as Zelensky will privately be the profiteer and enrich himself. Point 57. From the Russian point of view, the unilateral security order controlled by America with the U.S. military in Europe, as it has crystallized and developed since 1992, is not acceptable to the Kremlin under Putin. 58. Russia wants to create a cordon sanitaire, i.e., a buffer zone resp. A security strip between itself and the West. 59. This is so that Russia can remain independent and exist in peace. Billy, that is also to be understood when the military world domination ambitions of the USA are considered, which obviously still have not recognized the stupidity of the governments of various countries, although they are very clever in their hypocrisy, because for these stupids it is not enough to think correctly. Only very few in the governments are really human beings who are capable of correct thinking and who, moreover, see with open eyes and senses what reality and its truth is. But we should really have talked enough about these things of the whole theater, which is nonsense anyway, because there are other things to talk about. For example, I have a question concerning the pranema, as Sfath once called it, when he said that it could also be produced on Earth from, and compressed in such a manner that it would be over 160 times harder than the diamond we know, although the product in its basic unit would not be bigger than an atom. My question is this: what is this product used for by you? Ta, 60. This material is used by us by compacting the outer shell of our flying apparatus with it and making it invulnerable in every kind and wise. 61. This completely protects the flying apparatus as well as the occupants from any natural and technical influences, as well as from any possibility of damage or destruction. Billy, the various alloys that I had received from your daughter Semjace, which were of various alloy stages, you build your spaceships with this metal alloy. Are they all then coated with this pranema? Ta, 62. They will, which will ensure our safety. Billy, and if your ships were fired upon, what would happen? Ta, 63. Nothing. Projectiles of any kind would ricochet harmlessly due to the hardness of the metal, if they would reach them at all, which will never be the case, because the energetic protection that is applied around the respective flying object repels any foreign object. Billy, aha, and how far does this protective shield surround your beam ships, if I may say so? Ta, 64. By terrestrial masses you would calculate the energy protection to be something around 3 meters. Billy, and this protective shield is really such that purely nothing can reach and damage a beam ship? Ta, 65. Yes, there is no possibility at all. 66. Furthermore, it is necessary that we discuss the following. But you are not supposed to call it up and write it down. Billy, then be it. Profits, preparation of the drawings. Note, the photorealistic renderings of the original drawings of Semjace, Bermunda and Ta published here were prepared by Bergteep and reviewed and accepted in this form by Bermunda. Any alterations or revisions are therefore considered forgeries. Nocademian, drawing by Bermunda. Nocademian, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Enoch, drawing by Bermunda. Enoch, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Elia, drawing by Bermunda. Elia, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Isaiah, drawing by Bermunda. Isaiah, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Jeremiah, drawing by Bermunda. Jeremiah, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Chmanuel, drawing by Semjace. Chmanuel, drawing by Christian Krukowski. Chmanuel, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Muhammad, drawing by Bermunda. Muhammad, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Judasish Kiriath, drawing by Ta. Judasish Kiriath, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep. Asina, drawing by Bermunda. Asina, photorealistic rendition by Bergteep.